Okay, good morning. I am Brian George. I'm an associate professor at Thomas Jefferson University in the School of Design and Engineering. And I'm here this morning with Ron Kander, who's also in at Thomas Jefferson. Ron, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Brian. Ron Kander, Dean of the Kanbar College of Design, Engineering, and Commerce here at Thomas Jefferson University, and also Associate Provost for Applied Research at Jefferson.
Okay, and Ron, what's your background?
I'm a chemical engineer by training, Carnegie Mellon and University of Delaware. Then I worked for a few years at DuPont as an engineer in polymer composite materials and material science of polymers and composites. And then I started teaching in academia at Virginia Tech in engineering and material science, and then moved to James Madison University, and then came here to what was Philadelphia University in 2011 to be Dean of Kanbar College, and have been here ever since.
Has it really been 9 years?
Yes, it is.
Wow.
Coming up on my 10th anniversary, believe it or not.
Okay, well, congratulations. Okay, so to give a bit of background, I'm not quite the chemical engineer. My background is textile science and PhD in fiber and polymer science, both from North Carolina State University. And when I graduated there, I started off at Philadelphia College of Textiles and Science in 1999, which later became Philadelphia University and is now Thomas Jefferson University. So my background is textiles, and I've been doing some work with hemp and other natural fibers throughout the years, mostly in terms of nonwovens, which are not woven or knitted, made directly from fibers rather than yarns. So we're here this morning to talk about hemp and to discuss whether it is a fad or whether it's something that will become a long, sustainable fiber. So Ron, could you start off telling us the difference between hemp and marijuana?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a good place to start. Thanks, Brian. They both come from the same species of plant. The Cannabis sativa L is a genus of plants and species of plants that both include marijuana and hemp. The primary difference is the cannabidiols, which are some of the chemicals in the plant. THC is a specific one of those, tetrahydrocannabinol, and that material is the thing that gives you the neurological high that is associated with marijuana. So plants that have a very high level of that are grown specifically for that purpose. However, there are 150 or so of these cannabidiols in hemp, and hemp plants that have very, very low amounts of THC, less than 0.3%, are categorized as industrial hemp plants because they really aren't associated to marijuana in the sense of using them to get a high. They're really plants that give you essential oils, protein powders from seeds, fiber, things like that. So they're industrial plants from the same family, but not associated with marijuana at all.
Okay, so you are part of the hemp steering committee for the state of Pennsylvania. Can you tell us a bit about that, what it entails?
Sure, absolutely.
The goals are?
I'm sorry, what?
What the goals are, what being on the committee means?
Sure, absolutely. So Pennsylvania, so the laws changed in end of 2018. So in 2019 is when industrial hemp was legally separated from marijuana so that people could start growing it for industrial applications. When that happened with the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the DEA, Pennsylvania, among other states, started to give out licenses and permits to let people grow hemp. So just to give you an idea of that growth, 2017 was the first year they did that. They had 16 permits, and it went up to over 300 by 2019. And this last year, there were over 500 growing permits for hemp. So as it's growing now, this industry, the state Department of Agriculture, the PA Department of Agriculture, realized that they needed to listen to the voice of the industry. So the Pennsylvania Hemp Steering Committee was formed, which is a group of more than 60 stakeholders from industry, academia, and government, We have everything from farmers to processors to manufacturers of products, of end products. And the mission of the steering committee is to advance the hemp industry in Pennsylvania and provide counsel and guidance to the PA Department of Agriculture. So we have divided the committee up into 4 subcommittees to try to address the various dimensions of this issue. So we have a farmer and processor education and outreach subcommittee. We have a supply chain and market development subcommittee. We have a research opportunities and needs subcommittee, and we have a policy and regulation subcommittee. So those groups go out and talk to the industry in the state and then bring information back to the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. And then also the communications 2 ways. When the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture wants to get information out to the industry, we port that out through our contacts. So we've been trying to help them put their rules in place for the next growing season. Some of the logistics, they would propose a rule. Sometimes there's unintended consequences to that to a farmer or a processor. So we try to inform them when they're doing something that might cause a problem in the industry. And then we've also been doing things like writing letters to the US Department of Agriculture to try to encourage them to change some of their rules to allow farmers and processors a little more freedom in managing this new material.
Okay, thank you. So let's pivot for a second and look at the farmers. Most of the farmers I know, and I'm related to some farmers, and I live in a farming community now. Most of them are relatively conservative. Why, when they've got their cash crops of corn, wheat, soybeans, or hay, or something like that, why would they start growing hemp? Is there a benefit to this?
That's a very good question. So there's benefit in a couple ways. First of all, the amount of biomass you grow per acre is much higher than a lot of other crops, and the entire plant is usable. So there is the potential to make a lot more money per acre for a farmer once the market's developed for these materials. That's one reason. Another reason is it has a very short growing season. It grows in like 100 days. So they don't necessarily have to stop growing what they're currently growing. This could be a very good rotational crop to be a second growing. So if you grow corn or something and you harvest in July, you really don't have enough time to grow another corn crop in Pennsylvania, typically, but you could grow one growth of hemp. And the hemp plant itself is actually very good for the soil. The root system's really good. It returns a lot of nutrients to the soil. So it's a very good rotational crop that would add additional value to a farmer. So you're seeing a lot of farmers looking at this as one of the things they'll rotate through their fields.
Okay, thank you. So my understanding is that before they can harvest the crop, they have to have it analyzed for THC content. And if the THC content is too high, they would have to destroy it in some way, either plow it under, light the field on fire, which I'm sure the neighbors would love, or something along those lines. So why would a farmer risk that?
That's a really good question. That's a really good insight, Brian, because really one of the biggest things that the steering committee is trying to do is to work with the state and the federal government on the rules around testing and around crop, what you do with a crop that tests hot is what they call it if the THC is too high. And right now, we're trying to de-risk that process for the farmer. So for example, the testing procedure was typically taking the top flower from the top of the plant. Now, if you're growing for CBD oil, that makes sense. But if you're growing for fiber, which is what is becoming one of the larger markets for hemp, then a whole plant sample would make more sense. Randomly take from various parts of the plant, and the average THC level will be much lower. Secondly, if a plant tests hot, it shouldn't be allowed to be used for CBD oil because that oil would have a higher THC content. But rather than destroy it, we're proposing that the fiber and the hurd, which is the woody part of the stalk, should still be able to be recovered and used in non ingestible products like consumer goods and industrial goods. So you're right, there is some risk associated. And I think that's why you're seeing a lot of farmers moving away from growing hemp that's genetically designed for the oils, and you're seeing more people growing varietals that are specifically to get fiber, because I think the rules on fiber are going to be a lot looser for the farmers.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So you mentioned fibers and this thing called herd, which is spelled H-U-R-D, not to be confused with a herd of animals. Could you explain the different parts of the plants and their potential uses?
Sure. Yeah. So there's three or four primary things that you can do with the plant. If you grab what are called the greens off the plant, first of all, there's a process called decortication, which is sort of the separation process where you take the plant out of the ground, and after some preliminary work with it, you separate it into three primary streams. You would grab the greens, which are the flowers and the seeds off the plant, and that's where you would press to get CBD oil, which is again, not to be confused with anything that would get you high, but that oil has a lot of interesting medicinal purposes that we can talk about. Or take the seeds and grind them for flour, which is a very high protein flour. You can go to your local stores and buy hemp seed and hemp flour now, and it's a very, very good protein source. So that's one stream. The second stream would be the fibers that you'd pull from the stalk of the plant. They're on the outside of the plant, outside of the stalk. And those fibers run the length of the stalk. So if you grow very high plants, which they can grow up to 10 or 15 feet, the plants that are grown for fiber, those fibers can be stripped off and used in long fiber form or in short fiber form for some non-wovens and other applications. And then the center of the plant, the center of the stalk, is a woody material that you refer to as herd. And it basically is just a cellulose, a wood, just like you would get from a bamboo plant or from a tree. And it can be used in a lot of applications where you just want that woody biomass, like paper or pulping and things like that. So those are the three primary streams. And that's why the plant's so interesting, because in a lot of cases, plants, one or two of those are useful, but in this case, all three of those parts of the plants have value.
So would the leaves be considered an edible material? Could you potentially feed that to either animals or maybe put it in a salad assuming that the THC content isn't very high?
Yeah, the greens, the leaves and the flowers are often used as animal feed because of the high protein content. And CBD oil is a beneficial oil to the human body too. So yeah, it is used as animal feed. And then the herd is often used as animal bedding for like horses and large animals too, for their stalls. But yeah, absolutely, that is edible. And you will see the greens and the seeds and the fibers being fed to animals. And I've never seen the leaves used as actual food for humans, but I don't see why you couldn't. I don't know if it's how tough they are to eat. You know, they might not be palatable, but there's nothing about them that would be dangerous.
Right. Well, I've seen animals eat poison ivy leaves, so yeah. Maybe they're not that picky. So some of these hemp plants are used for bioremediation. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, they do. One of the other advantages of the plant, in terms of other than returning nutrients to the soil as well as they do, is that they do absorb materials from the soil because they have a very strong root system, and they will aerate soil, but they'll also pull out heavy metals. So there's been interesting experiments where growing hemp on land as a remediation, because the roots then hold the soil and prevent it from eroding, but also then the plant basically sequesters heavy metals from the soil and recovers the soil. So that's an interesting application of the plant in non, agricultural applications where you're using it as a remediation. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and do you think that people would use those fibers or the greens or anything from those particular plants for any type of application, or do you think they would end up perhaps buried in a landfill or maybe burned for energy?
That's a good question. I think that, if you're going to burn it, you'd have to burn it in a clean manner because there are going to be heavy metals in the plant. And so I think in any use, you'd have to be careful about what you're going to do with the sequestered heavy metals. I've not seen people at this point try to use those plants then for subsequent applications, but if one applies care to doing that, there's really no reason why you couldn't. But right now, I've seen people doing these remediation experiments, but not then using the plant yet for new applications. As I said, most states have only had programs going for about 3 years now. So people are just getting past the research stage and getting to the commercial stage for some of these other applications.
Okay, so that kind of brings us to the next series of questions. What is the business model exactly for the hemp industry? Is it a push type where the growers try to push it into the system, or is it a pull type where the consumers go out there and demand it? Yesterday, for example, well, 2 days ago, I was in REI, and they had some socks that said hemp socks, and then they had a whole list of reasons why you should wear hemp socks. And I was really looking around for someone I can question about this, but unfortunately there was nobody there for me to ask these questions. So I'm going to ask you, what do you think the business model is for this? Is it going to be consumers that are demanding hemp and the industry fulfills that need or that demand, or is it going to be industry pushing it out there, or maybe even the farmers pushing it out there and saying, we've got this wonderful material here, find a use for it?
That's a good question. The answer is yes. Yeah, I think you're going to see both of those happening. So it's a very interesting business model problem to deal with, how to grow the supply chain in this industry. I think everybody sees the value of a stable, high volume hemp industry in the United States. You have to realize that other countries around the world who have not had the regulations we've had have been using hemp as a raw material for more than for centuries. So there are existing business models out there. So hemp as a material could, in some applications, is a lower cost solution as a substitute for other biomasses. There are some applications in which its properties are superior. The socks are a great example, where the antibacterial and the anti-odor natural properties of this material are great for things like socks, sportswear, and things like that. Military in a lot of countries have been using hemp in socks for years. And then the third one is it's a highly sustainable source of cellulose. So I see it replacing a lot of where people are worried about the carbon footprint of their processes. And I can see the sustainability push moving us toward hemp as a raw material. And then fourth, there's some marketing advantages of this material. They're just, the most supply chains that people are envisioning are local. This material is hard to transport large distances in its raw state. So you're going to see a lot of made in USA, made locally, local artisans, local farmers being able to participate in vertical integration to products. And all of those are really good for social sustainability, because you can grow and manufacture in areas where people need stable incomes and jobs that pay better than minimum wage. So I think you're going to see those converge. Farmers see a more profitable business. Processors see a way to really vertically integrate and make money on transforming the material. And then as the properties are explained to the public, you're starting to see demand for products that take advantage of these materials because they're high performance and more sustainable. So it's, I think, a mix. The real challenge, though, is trying to go from no supply chain in the almost no supply chain in the US to something that can compete on the world market and stay profitable along the way. So it's a really interesting business model problem. And that's why it's so cool that, business students and engineering students and technology students and design students are all interested in their aspects of participating in this emerging market.
Okay, thank you. So I have two questions, and I'll start with one that's perhaps a bit closer to my heart. So you mentioned that that you think that this will drive local manufacturing. So if we look at the history of the textile industry, it started off as being a localized industry with people working out of their houses to weave fabric, spin yarn, and things of that nature. And over time, it's gotten larger and larger and become less or more local, less localized and more centralized. Do you think that the growth of hemp in states throughout the country and around the world will lead to more localized textile processing?
That's a really good question, Brian. And I think so for two reasons. I might be too much of an optimist, but first of all, there are so many varietals of this plant, and the different varietals grow better in different regions. And the properties of the material are very different across varietals. If you see a plant, if you see a field that's being grown for CBD oil, and then you go to a field that is being grown for fiber, you would think you're looking at two completely different plants. A CBD plant looks like a small Christmas tree. It's 2 or 3 feet tall, and it's bushy like a little Christmas tree would be. A fiber plant looks like bamboo. It's maybe 10 or 15 foot high, growing only a few inches apart from its neighboring plant. So the fields don't even look like the same material. So I think you're going to see that the varietals that grow best in different regions are going to then be localized to make products in that region from the varietals that are optimized for that region. And that's different than a lot of other fiber plants, which you basically grow the same plant around the world. And secondly is because of what happened in the fiber industry in the past, the state and the stakeholders in this industry are very hypersensitive to not allowing that to happen. So for example, there's a group called All Together Now PA that I'm a member of, and they're looking at trying to maintain local supply chains for products like hemp. And they're working with the state agricultural folks to try to keep that as regional and local as we can. So I think because people are aware of it, and because of the nature of the plants, we can probably mitigate that happening as rapidly with this industry as it has with others.
Okay, thank you. So I've been teaching college for a number of years, more than some of my students have been alive. And I've seen this shift in the past, let's say 10 years, where students are much more focused on sustainability and classes that deal with sustainability, sustainable dyes, sustainable processing, and things of that nature, as well as sustainable materials. Whereas when I started, polyesters and their synthetics were the wonder fibers. And as a student, we used to hear that as well, that, you know, the future is plastic, if we go back to The Graduate, for example. So do you think what's helping hemp become more popular is a generational shift, that the younger people in this country are more open to the idea of sustainable materials? They're more concerned about the future of sustainability, and even that at the end of the product's life, that you could perhaps throw it in a compost pile and have it break down rather than landfilling it.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're dead on that the not just younger folks, I think the population as a whole is more aware of the problems that we didn't realize we were creating earlier. Even, you know, things like microplastics and stuff, which we're seeing now as emerging problems, that people realize that what looked like cheaper products that we were able to make in the past weren't really cheaper if you could figure out a way to capture all the costs associated with those materials, including end-of-life costs and impacts on the environment. So as we've gotten better at understanding life cycle assessment and sort of cradle to grave costs, the public has figured out that what looks cheaper isn't always cheaper. So I think that the push towards sustainable renewable resources and end-of-life solutions for natural products is going to drive markets and give hemp an advantage over a lot of the current synthetics. I completely agree.
Okay, so several years ago, I was working with some outside people who were big on KNF. There was a fellow who was importing KNF into the U.S. and his goal was to see it put into automotive applications. And ultimately, while it worked, it came down to the KNF wasn't as cheap as the other materials, which were mostly synthetics. And so in a cost-conscious industry such as medical or automotive, or even apparel to some degree, what benefit is there to hemp? So we've seen lots of fibers that have come up in the past. Core is making inroads, for example, but KNF and some jute and things of those natures have come up and been touted as the next big thing, only to fall by the wayside at some point.
Mm-hmm.
So why do you think hemp is going to be different this time?
That's a good question. That's a good question. One thing is that of all those plants, I do believe that hemp, in terms of biomass per acre, is still one of the highest biomass per acre crops that you can grow. So in many applications where cellulose is a good solution, I would imagine that that's going to drive hemp to be one of the cheaper sources of that cellulose. So if it's not a performance issue, I think it could be a pure cost issue. So that would help with the cost. There are some performance advantages of hemp. The fibers in hemp are one of the higher cellulose content fibers, so they're stiffer and stronger than a lot of other natural fibers. So I think they'll compete there. Plus, with a 100-day growing cycle, it's a much more renewable resource than a lot of the others. And it makes good financial sense as a renewable crop because the other parts of the plant are also usable. So I think that the business model is a little more sound for hemp than for some of those other materials. But you bring up a good point. It has yet to be proven in the US. Now, the one advantage we have is that hemp as a material is very robust in China and other countries that have never stopped producing it. So there's a lot of business models out there of successful hemp businesses. So I think that it's just a matter of how we do it in the United States, not if we can do it in the US.
Okay, thank you. So I have a question from the audience, and it is, I'll read the whole thing. Due to the increasing number of sales legalizing cannabis in one or more states, estimates put the legal market for cannabis or hemp, I guess, at over $70 billion per year by 2027, which would exceed the market for corn or wheat. CPAs will be needed to know, or will be interested in knowing the potential for new business here. So what markets do you see all this material going into, all this fiber, this herd? You've mentioned a couple of different things. Yeah. Are there any areas where you expect to see explosive growth maybe?
Yeah, so I think that we've been talking about this for a long time, and I think what we need are entry markets that have large volume and where you can incrementally introduce hemp as a replacement material for other materials, so that you're not asking somebody to fundamentally change their manufacturing process on day one. And so when you think about that as places for potential investment, you end up with things like paper and cardboard. You end up with building materials. Hempcrete has shown that it's a really good material, hemp reinforced concrete, particle boards, synthetic woods, insulating materials. Those are all applications that are relatively easy to enter. They don't involve putting this material in the human body, so your risk is relatively low from an environment or from an enforcement point of view from DEA, and they're relatively low cost initial investments. So I'm seeing the investors that are out there are moving away from the CBD industry because there's a huge bubble that's already busting in CBD. I saw some estimates that said it would take about somewhere between 10,000 and 50,000 acres of hemp grown for CBD to satisfy the entire US market of CBD oil. So it's not an industry that's gonna blow up and be investable in terms of scale. Whereas for industrial applications and consumer applications of fiber and herd, they're talking literally tens of millions of acres could be grown to sustain businesses in that area. So I think you're seeing investment money move toward that because of the volume of products that you could grow. And another one that I know you're very familiar with, Brian, is geotextiles. It's a really great material to think of in large volume geotextile manufacturing. So yeah, I think those are the places that you're going to see. They're not as sexy as the the medical cannabis, the recreational cannabis, marijuana markets, but from a long-term profitability point of view, I think they might be better.
Okay. So bringing up the long term, what do you think the long-term market holds, and what is the role of the various players? So we've got the farmers, we've got investors, we have private industry, universities, and consumers. What do you think each role of them may be in making hemp successful?
Sure. The domino that has to fall now is the processors. That's really the linchpin right now. So the farmers know how to grow. What we need are processing facilities that will take the plant as it comes out of the ground and transform it into a form that is ubiquitously usable by multiple manufacturing industries. So the question right now in terms of business model has been, do farmers vertically integrate into that business? Do private investors form processing facilities and then do co-ops with farmers, and much like tobacco and cotton and other ones did in the past? So that's a big piece. And then I think the manufacturing part of the problem, if we do the processing properly, won't be difficult, because we want to put the hemp into a form that makes it work in existing manufacturing processes. As you know, we've been looking at things like how you incorporate this as a natural reinforcement fiber in composite materials, so that people could take injection molding pellets and put them right in their injection molding processes like they do now to make parts. So I think the manufacturing part and the consumer product part are existing markets. It's the grower processor piece, which is where the investment needs to be made. And that's where investors, banks, federal government, state governments with low interest loans and workforce development loans are going to have to come into the business now to complete that supply chain.
Okay, and what is the role of universities in all of this?
We have two pretty important roles. I think that we have to develop a basic material science understanding of the plant and the various pieces of the plant, and provide that to the industry. I think we have to also develop the engineering processes necessary to do that transformation I just mentioned, to take hemp biomass and put it in a form that's usable and understand its mechanical and physical properties, and engineer the large volume processing equipment necessary for that. So that's sort of the nuts and bolts of what we need to do. We can also do the systems modeling of the business models and supply chain, because since these are new businesses, people need to de-risk them and understand what their investments might yield. So if we could model some of those businesses, since they don't currently exist, that might lower the anxiety of investors. But more importantly, above all of that, is this is the Wild West in this industry, and people are really struggling to get true information. So I think universities can be the book of truth place, because we don't have an economic dog in the fight like companies do. So every time you look at a piece of equipment in this industry, they'll tell you their piece of equipment is great and everybody else's is lousy. Every time you go to some company that has seed, they'll say their seed's best and nobody else's seed is any good, because they're all trying to sell. So people are confused, and they're looking for this book of truth place where they can come and get an honest assessment of a piece of equipment or a seed varietal or a business model. So I think that's another big thing for the universities to contribute to this.
So are you saying that it's more than like the textile schools, the material science schools, that maybe it's also the agricultural schools get involved with this and do growth trials to determine which variety is best for a given application or maybe a given geography?
Absolutely. I think partnering with the ag schools is important. We've talked to the ag extension at Penn State and worked with them some. We're talking to Del Valley now and looking at doing some stuff with them. We've talked to Delaware State down in the state of Delaware. all of which are ag programs. And there has to be this connection between people who understand the seeds and the growing conditions to get a certain plant, and then the material science of what comes out of that plant. So there's a really interesting need for an interface there. So we're trying to write some collaborative proposals with some ag schools just for that reason.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, it's predicted that in the future, with climate changing, that everything will become more arid and warmer. How will this affect the growth of hemp as far as in the field?
Yeah, that's a good question. The plant, like I said, there's so many varietals of this plant that you can find varietals that grow in essentially any climate. People grow them in northern Canada. People grow them in Central America. People grow them in, wet areas of the Pacific Rim. So there are varietals that grow everywhere. It's one of the most ubiquitous plants in the world. In fact, I have a graduate student originally from India, and she said that hemp is one of the 5 sacred plants in the Hindu religion, because thousands of years ago it was considered one of the 5 sacred plants. So I think as climate change occurs, there's going to be a change in the agricultural systems in many states in the United States, and in some places hemp is going to become a more profitable option for them because of the increased growing seasons. And there's already some places in Kentucky and southern parts of the United States where you can grow three rotations of hemp in 1 year because of the 100-day growing cycle. So, if that moves north, that changes the business model dramatically.
Right. Okay. So when you say 3 growings, is hemp kind of like the grass in your lawn, where you can cut it and then it'll return, or do you have to, once you cut it, do you have to plant new seeds and start over again?
Yeah, the latter. You plant new seeds and start over again.
Okay.
But, so you could harvest and then replant in some places up to 3 times.
Okay. Thank you for the clarification. You may recall that this summer there was a derecho, a rain event, rain and wind in Iowa, and a lot of farmers lost their corn crops because the wind and the rain flattened their crops, bent them, and so while some plants were able to recover, the majority of them were left damaged beyond recovery. Would hemp suffer from something like that, or if a wind event came along, is it flexible enough that it would bend over, kind of like a pine tree, and then pop back up after the wind is gone and still be harvestable?
That's a good question. I know that the cold snap that hit Colorado severely damaged their hemp crop. So there was damage to their crops when they had that early snow event. So it's not resistant to those kind of things. It's more resistant to pests, and it doesn't need as much water. So in terms of like droughts and things like that, it's more resilient to those things. But I would imagine in a large scale wind event or a large scale rain event, you could probably damage the plant and the soil enough that you might not be able to get it out of the ground before it rots or something like that. So I think it's still susceptible to the problems, all plants have, but probably less so because it's a little hardier of a grow. It's literally a weed. So, it grows in lots of conditions.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So I have another question from the audience, and I'll read this one in its entirety. The tobacco plant has a long history of use for its own natural products. Given its growth properties and extraction capabilities, it has also been used through genetic engineering as a source for production and harvest of other compounds. Does a hemp plant have a similar potential as a natural bioreactor through genetic engineering?
Oh, that's a great question, Jerry. I personally do not know of research where people have been trying to genetically alter the plant for that reason. Because it's a fast grower, I would imagine that it has potential to be used for that, because that's obviously an attribute that makes that kind of research easier. But I'll have to look that up. That's a good question, Jerry. I do not know the answer to it, and I'll try to look it up and let you know.
Okay, thanks, Ron. One comment real quick. The AI CPA will be holding a cannabis industry conference in early December regarding how to account for and report on hemp and hemp production. And they see, so the comment is that the CPA industry sees this as a product with future financial viability. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, investors are flocking to this industry, especially on the industrial side. A lot of people, and I've said this before to many people, is that in Pennsylvania, York and Lancaster County are two of the largest hemp growing counties in Pennsylvania, and it is primarily the Amish and Mennonite communities that are growing hemp there and have a history of growing it over hundreds of years. And those farmers are very shrewd business people, and they're very smart farmers from an economics point of view. So the fact that so many of those farmers in York and Lancaster have bet on hemp as a crop tells me that they've done their homework and that there is a viable market for them, because they don't make rash decisions when they make their choices. And many of them are going to hemp and are very strong on hemp as a new product for them. So yeah, I think that I'm not surprised to see that investment conferences. And speaking of plugs, by the way, Pennsylvania's Hemp Summit is coming up on December 8th and 9th. It's a virtual event. And if you do PA Hemp Summit on the web, you'll find the information about attending some of the events. We're going to have a local supply chain session on the 9th that I'm chairing.
So is that a free event, or do people have to pay to go to it?
It's a pay event. It's a paid event. There is a discount for people that have Pennsylvania licenses for growing, and there's a discount for students. So students can get a discount code based on their university email addresses.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Is there anything else that you want to tell us about hemp?
No, I think this has been a great conversation. I mean, I think that we're trying to position ourselves as a university that is looking at this in a systems way, trying to look at the business side and the engineering side and the product design side. And we're trying to partner with other universities and with industry and with the government. We want to be a hemp center of excellence to provide that book of truth that I mentioned to the industry. And Pennsylvania is a big player in this. So I think we're uniquely positioned geographically too. So, we'll be able to continue this conversation for years to come.
Okay, wonderful. I look forward to that. Ron, I have one more question, and then we'll let you go. So apparently you can't legally ship hemp across state lines. So interstate pricing becomes rather distorted, anywhere from $300 to $5,000 per pound. So do you think this interstate restriction is going to stifle the industry in any way?
That's a good question. That's one of the things that we're lobbying with the USDA and the DEA to change. Pennsylvania has, in addition to growing licenses, there are processing licenses. And in Pennsylvania, you're allowed to move from growers to processors who have permits freely. What we've asked the USDA to do is to nationalize the processing license process so that processing can happen across multiple states. Right now, we have some people in the hemp steering committee that have farms both in Maryland and Pennsylvania, and they can't even move their crops to the same processor. So we're trying to get some harmonization of the rules at the USDA level so that that problem goes away. But you are right, and Ray's comment is right, that is a problem right now in terms of getting things moved across state lines.
Okay. Well, Ron, I think we've run out of time, so thank you very much for your insights.
My pleasure. This was a real fun conversation, Brian. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. And audience, thank you for your questions. I appreciate that, or all your input and your questions or comments. So reminder, there's the Hemp Summit. Is that correct, Ron?
Yes, PA Hemp Summit.
Okay, and that's December 18th, 19th?
8th and 9th. 8th and 9th.
8th and 9th. Okay, sorry. And then there is also the AICPA is holding a cannabis industry conference in early December. You can look both of these up on the web and find more information about them. So thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving next week. And we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.